Thank you. I'd like to call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for February 6th, 2023. Thank you all for being here. We have three items on our agenda tonight. Item number one is a zoning code modernization. Item number two is a clean fleet retail delivery fee tax exemption. And item number three is a review of council rules, order and procedure. You want to take a moment to introduce a guest tonight?
I would. Thank you,
Very
Mr.
good.
Mayor. We're very excited to have Rhiannon. She goes by Ree, if you'd like, if you can't say Rhiannon. Curry is our new executive assistant. This is her start of her second week. She came back, as we were joking just earlier, so Allie didn't. Serious, yeah. So, Ree, do you want to tell the council a little bit about yourself, where you came from? She comes with an extensive amount of administrative experience, so we're very happy to have her. So,
Well, thank you. Where do I start? Let's see. I did mortgages for about 20 years, and then I moved away to Saguache County and worked for the treasurer's office for a little bit, and then promoted into the road and bridge department, which led me back to Colorado after my husband passed. And I got on with CDOT, where I've been for the last 3 years, working in their maintenance department. And then I came here. So I have a little bit of government experience, but never city. So I'm excited to be here.
she said the best for last.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you here. We will open our meeting, as we do most of our meetings, with public comment. I don't think I have anyone signed up to speak, but we're going to check that. But if you're here and haven't signed up and would like to speak, I think our first speaker then is Kim Calamino, and if you would please give us your name and spell your last name and an address, and then you'll have 3 minutes.
Okay. Hi. Kim Calamino, 4070 Dover Street. And good evening, Mayor Starker and council members and staff. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I will be very brief. I appreciate and commend staff for their thorough assessment, clear explanation, and many recommendations for cleanups, changes, and potential additions to our zoning code that will result in its modernization and greater effectiveness. I concur with their recommendations and look forward to your discussion and forward movement on these matters. Of particular interest to me in this regard is your and the community's prioritization of affordable housing. Among the topics in the zoning recommendations, and there are others, but I would say I am most interested in the need to update the public hearing requirements for subdivision plats. Those requirements as they stand now can be confusing, cause delays and uncertainty among developers who might want to come here, and we don't want any of that. We should provide waivers for parkland dedications for deed-restricted affordable housing projects, as well as reduce or remove parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing projects. I note those in particular, but there may have been others. I encourage you to move forward at pace with these, as well as with studying the need for any additional code amendments that may be necessary to support affordable housing, whether deed-restricted or not, because it's a big deal, as you know. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I have no one else here signed up to speak or in the hall to speak, and no one online, so we will close our citizens' right to speak and go to agenda item number one. This is a zoning code modernization. Mr. Goff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will turn it over to Lauren Miklek, our acting community development director.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my comments brief because Scott did all the heavy lifting on this, and he's going to guide us through the memo. It's a longer memo because, frankly, we have been keeping a running list probably for a number of years of things that needed to get cleaned up or corrected, and then bigger topics that have arisen more recently that certainly require a little bit more thought and discussion. We know that some of these will need subsequent discussion. We would expect that some things could be moving forward more quickly. So while it could take a little bit of time, know that it's completely okay to say, we think that you need to just bring that one back. It's okay that there may be more questions than answers tonight. We don't expect to solve everything, but we'll give it our best shot. And Scott, maybe without further ado, Scott Cutler is our senior planner. He's been at the city for what, maybe 5 years or so. He's probably brought a couple different code amendments to you all. You could tell from the memo, hopefully. He's a good writer and concise, and I'll let you walk us through these topics.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, it is a long memo. We do have a few things to cover tonight. It's broken into two parts, although there are a few different topics. It's really divided into two sections. Article 11 is our mixed-use code, and then Article 4 is our subdivision code, and we're making recommendations to update both of those, not only to support the affordable housing strategy discussion, but also we haven't actually comprehensively looked at these code sections in several years, and in the case of the mixed use, we haven't really looked at that code section as a whole since 2010, although we do have a running list of items that we'll want to cover and potentially update in the code. So with that, I will kind of run through each topic individually, and maybe we can, after each topic, have some discussion. So I'll start with the mixed use section. That was adopted in 2010 as Article 11 of Chapter 26, which is the zoning code. Before 2010, there were no mixed use zones in the city, and City Council approved the creation of the mixed use zone, and then later rezoned portions of 38th Avenue and Wadsworth to mixed use zone districts to facilitate redevelopment and reinvestment. We've seen a lot of investment in those corridors, especially in the past 5 to 7 years, and that really shows the success of those districts. We have not looked at the code comprehensively since 13 years ago, which is a really long time in the scheme of things. And we've seen a lot of development continue to happen, so that's one of the reasons why we want to look at the code, not only because we kind of know how it works at this point, but also we know that portions of the code need to be updated to provide clarity as well as support affordable housing efforts. So with that, I'll go ahead and go into each discussion topic item. Topic 1 is really about code cleanup. This list actually started in 2012. Staff quickly realized, and this was before my time at the city, that there were items that needed clarity, but it was never prioritized due to staff resources, other demands. We were really busy. We were also a smaller department at that time. But we know that this needs to get updated at some point, especially with understanding lessons learned from reviewing development under this code. So we are requesting these cleanup items proceed to a code amendment in early 2023. I'll kind of summarize each item really quickly. There's a lot, and we can, at the end, basically we're making a recommendation that we pursue all of these as one code amendment that's essentially a code cleanup, but I'll quickly summarize all the different items. So right now we don't have any standards for accessory buildings in mixed use. Accessory buildings can mean a shed, a garage, or now an ADU. And we are relying upon an administrative policy instead of code sections in order to allow those types of buildings right now. So we really need a code basis. We want to clarify and update some open space requirements. Current parts of the code are pretty insufficient. We want to refine building placement and orientation and clarify that the community development director, not developers, get to decide certain things in that aspect. We need to clarify some separation requirements for drive-throughs and gas stations. We need to update permitted uses, not only to cover new permitted uses that weren't really thought of at the time, such as food truck courts, but also to update definitions to be more all-encompassing with our professional planning association recommendations. We also want to update some building material requirements. There's not a lot of detail in those code sections. Including we allow siding, but there's not any details about what types of siding are allowed or brick buildings are allowed. We need to clarify and add some cross-references to the city charter regarding height and density. That's been a really confusing thing for developers, not knowing that we also have that charter requirement. Updating and clarifying bicycle parking. We're pretty outdated in terms of what's required. Clarifying height bonuses in the code, updating screening requirements to be consistent with other fencing, and last but not least, updating screening requirements for rooftop mechanical equipment to be user-friendly. So with that, I know that's a really long list. Let me know if there are any questions or if council is generally supportive of addressing the items in this list in a code amendment.
Thank you. Questions at this time? Ms. Dozman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Oh, I have a short mic tonight. So I circled the allow artificial turf in limited circumstances. So I know that we're specifically discussing like mixed-use development, but is that something that we could carry over to like residential code as well?
I think it could be. This is specifically focused, though, on open space for more commercial development. So a lot of times someone will want to have artificial turf at a restaurant or plaza space. I think as far as allowing artificial turf in, like, for a residential front yard, that's probably a bigger policy discussion because that's a pretty big difference than having something like on a playground or a plaza.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I don't know how much planning gets a request as far as like artificial turf for commercial uses. I mean, I know that we address that slightly with Zen Doggy Zen and businesses of that nature, but I think I've had more residents ask as like why they can't have artificial turf in their backyard. And so like that's just something that maybe we look at around the same time, if
Yeah.
possible.
The future study session list includes water-wise landscaping, which I think, Mr. Ohm, you brought up. Probably going to expand that scope a little bit and include artificial turf in there, sort of the bigger conversation we haven't had about landscaping in a number of years, so we'll bring that back.
And then I did have a second question if there was no one else.
No, go ahead, Paul.
As far as like building facade, are you looking to restrict certain uses or certain materials, or would this be broadening the scope? Because like from just reading it, it looks as if, you know, we want to be able to have more like stringent say over the materials that are used.
Yeah, right now in the code, we have a list of allowed materials and prohibited materials, and siding, like wood siding, is not on either of those lists. Normally, we would consider something that's not in the code to be prohibited, but we've actually, just given other communities, we've actually allowed siding in some limited circumstances, and we're just seeking to add that to a list of allowed materials, but not over like a certain percentage. So a building couldn't be entirely wood siding, it would still have to incorporate some brick. But we just want to add clarity in the code in line with other communities. And then the brick specifically, right now the code requires changes in material on facades, so you've got to have multiple materials. We've actually had a few requests, and other communities do this, where if someone wants to build an entirely brick building that's like that classic architecture, our code currently doesn't allow us to do that. But that's something that's pretty common that other communities allow.
Okay.
So kind of going above and beyond and adding more brick than normal, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, like, I know that the goal here is to clean up the code, but I think I want it to be easier for businesses to build here and to move here, so I don't want to be more restrictive, so thank you for
Yeah, I
clarifying
think it'll
that.
give more options.
Thank you. Councilor Ohm?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on the artificial turf. I think there are some not typical, unique situations where, somebody could look at it from the standpoint of you have maybe a shaded yard that needs to be used by, say dogs or something, and maybe that might be an option, but I'm comfortable with staff having that a little bit of direction, if that came about. The front yards, I'm not that much in favor of the artificial turf, and I've seen a couple of them in Wheat Ridge. I think my opinion is just I've seen people try to wrap this around trees, and it's a little like carpet, and then the tree grows, and then it pulls it. But that's kind of what I'd have to say about that. I know we had a development that was recently on just to the north of us a long time ago. I can't think of the street name for the life of me, but it's where the fire department, Upham. Yeah, they had proposed some small little artificial turf areas, and we chatted about it a little bit, and I know that the public was kind of like, can we have it, can we not have it? And so there was that discussion. Thank you.
Additional questions? Counselor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. How long have you been working on this?
This memo,
Yeah.
about a month and a half, maybe 2 months.
I mean, all of these things that brought together and all that, because it seems like an awful lot for one meeting,
Sure.
okay? And there are some things on here, like, I have questions like, units that have agreements recorded against the property limiting the rent or sales price of that unit based on income. Are you talking commercial?
I think
think-
that's the next
That's on our next.
item. So we're still on topic number 1.
Oh, I'm going through the, okay, my whole thing's
Yeah,
highlighted.
just pages 2, 3, and 4.
Just 2, 3, and 4, huh?
Yeah, just topic 1 for now.
Okay, okay,
We'll be there shortly.
let's see. Okay, I do have a question here about, comparing what City and County of Denver has done and also Foothills Regional Housing, comparing housing type parking requirements. Am I still on the right ones? I'm on 2. I need to stay on 1.
Yes.
No, we're getting to 2. We're getting to 2.
We're not to 2 yet, but stay please on 1.
Okay, okay, all right. It just seems like an awful lot for one meeting for us to, what does council decide what they want to do? And all this kind of stuff, because you've been thinking about it for a really long time. I'm not a planner. And looking at this, I look at this, zoning to me is about the people who live in this city. Okay, it's not just what the city wants to do compared to what other cities are doing. And this is a big issue for people who have lived here.
Sure. If there's any topic that we need to bring back, which we acknowledged at least a couple in here, we can certainly break this into smaller chunks and move them forward. A couple of these have just been sitting, like Scott said, on the back burner, and the next topic that we'll get to advances sort of the recently approved housing strategy. So
And Sam, when you say MUN, are you saying multi-use neighborhood,
mixed-use neighborhood, exactly.
which we have or don't have now?
It's one of our zone districts that we do have adopted.
And where are those?
Predominantly 38th Avenue from Sheridan to Wadsworth and a couple of smaller parcels throughout the
You're
city.
talking corridor?
Most of 38th Avenue is zoned MUN
Yeah.
between Sheridan and
It's
Wadsworth.
not the individual neighborhoods, though.
No, it's not a zone district that's embedded in a neighborhood. It's along like Collector and Minor
So you're
Arterial
talking
Streets.
corridors?
Yes.
Okay. Because I do have concern about this kind of thing running into established neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah, the mixed-use districts you'll find almost exclusively on corridors or near the transit station, not in neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Counselor Ohm?
Thank you. And staff has been talking, we're still on topic 1, and they talked a little bit about the bicycle storage, right? You, roughly. Are you looking into doing, and this would be more for multi-unit buildings, what I would call a bike barn type building? Are you looking at doing that? It's kind of like an accessory dwelling. I don't know how much you see it in Wheat Ridge, but do you understand what I'm talking about, though?
I know what you're talking about. I
Yeah.
haven't really looked into it. That sentence is really meant to say our requirements are really, really low compared to surrounding communities, so we're not asking for enough bicycle parking on site, especially for commercial businesses. So the intent was to basically increase the requirements, at least for like outdoor.
For commercial?
Commercial mixed-use sites. This is all for
Yeah.
the mixed-use zone districts.
I'm thinking more like definitely if there was, say, multi-units along like northeast corner of 44th and Kipling, or the TOD, of having these covered, they're basically like a big shed with where you hang the bikes up.
We've seen
Right.
those in the parking garages, so West End and the Parallel, and I think Edison had like bike corrals on each level or some of the levels of the parking garages. But yeah, I think our goal is to promote flexibility, so accommodate more bikes, and certainly we could include that as one of the ways to achieve the policy goal of allowing more bike parking.
And some cities do require interior bike parking for large apartment buildings. Wheat Ridge does not currently. It can be inside, it can be outside, it doesn't matter. But some cities specify, if you're over a certain number of units, you have.
Thanks.
Counselor Weaver?
I just had a quick question about that, because is a bike corral three-sided? But it says four sides.
Yeah, it's four-side, it's totally secure and enclosed. I think part of the premise is so that you don't have individuals with the bikes on their patios, so they're not having all that
Right,
you
right.
see from the street, that they're all inside these nice, clean.
Yeah.
And they're safe, because what happens is I think people worry about they lock their bike up in the little one, but if it's there for an extended time,
Yeah.
it might still not get stolen. And so this way, everything's in this little protected from the rain and elements.
Sure.
It's basically like a little garage.
Sure.
That
No,
is vertical.
it just made me think that in thinking about our definition of sheds and all of this, since I feel like I've had a lot of practice on the conversation of what a shed is, but in the last few years, but just thinking about some of the urban ag things that people are building, coops and things like that, and whether they are sheds or not sheds, and this concept of a loafing shed, which is a three-sided shed that animals can live in, and whether or not, how we think about those things, because there are a lot of those kinds of things in Wheat Ridge, but there are people moving to Wheat Ridge to have those sorts of experiences, and so may also want to build those sorts of things. So just to be more inclusive of uses for all this definition. Thank you.
Does that include she sheds?
Pardon?
Does that include she sheds?
Yeah, I've already got one of those.
Thank you. Before you go, I have a couple of things that I wanted to go through if I could. Just kind of to clarify a few things, and on these cleanup amendments, you would plan to bring these back to us as actual language?
It would come back as a code amendment, basically under one topic,
Okay,
as a code cleanup
okay, so
amendment.
just quickly and no detail, the separation between gas stations and drive-throughs, is that a sort of per feet distance, or?
Yes, so that's a current requirement, but the way this sentence is written in the code, it's very up for interpretation. We're trying to
Okay,
define it a little bit better so we can enforce that.
okay. I sort of took issue, maybe because I'm a restaurant owner, about having truck courts as a permitted use where restaurants would go. And I think it's fine to have food courts, but I'm not sure they should be in the same category as someone who's going to invest money in a piece of real estate and build a building and have a grease trap and put a real restaurant in. Maybe they could be a special use.
I can respond to that a little bit. So food truck courts are pretty common in other cities in the metro area, and there's certain minimum requirements that have to be met in order to be considered a food truck court. So it's not as simple as just bringing a food truck to a vacant lot. They have to have a primary building, so investing in restrooms. Often there would be a primary use associated with that, such as a bar building or indoor seating. So there's a little bit more investment than a food truck where someone could just come up and park next to a restaurant or bar. I'm trying to think of a good example. There's a lot in Salida and Buena Vista, but there's also some in other cities as well. But there's definitely more investment than just pulling up a truck on a vacant lot. You have to have a primary building, essentially, so you're building a new building.
And where do the patrons park when the trucks are there?
There would have to be on-site parking, same as a restaurant.
Well, I'll just sort of register that as an opinion. Ms. Hutchinson?
Would that be like what Edgewater's done? they have food trucks all
Parking-
over.
Sort of
and-
parking on the street, right?
No, they have a huge parking lot. They park food trucks, but, you know, they also have restaurants there and things like that, so I don't know when the food trucks are open, but.
Hang on, I had just a few more, and then I'll be with you. So then our bicycle parking, you would clarify the bicycle parking, that would sort of up our count?
Yes.
And what sort of changes would you make in the screening requirements? It was a little for the rooftop screening requirements.
So right now, our code is really unclear about when and if rooftop screening is required. So if someone is putting a new big mechanical unit on top of a building, at the time the mixed-use code was adopted, there was a lot of community feedback about not having those be really visible. So adding a screening requirement that matches the building so you don't see this giant HVAC thing on the roof. But our code is not very clearly written, and it's challenging to enforce that requirement in some circumstances of from where can you see that unit,
Okay.
what types of materials you need to use, are you screening all units, are you only screening new units? So I think it's one sentence, and it really needs to be more clear for staff. This has come up a lot when we were seeing reinvestment in these properties, and
Okay.
it's been really challenging
Okay.
for some people to actually do that because of the old buildings.
And then sort of, do you think where would you come down on it to sort of screen it from the primary observation point, if you will, as opposed to a secondary, and screen it with material that's compatible with the design of the structure and durable?
That's how it's written now. It's just not written very clearly, so we're trying to make
Okay.
it a little bit more clear in the code.
Okay, so that's really more of a wording.
Yeah, we're not really
All right.
proposing to change anything on a lot of these. It's just adding clarity for staff.
Okay, thank you. So then I had I think I had Ms. Dozman, Mr. Stites.
Well, I was just going to ask for clarification. Would the food court or the food truck, would that be similar to what's going in at like 38th and Quay by that, or the old Bradley?
Yes.
Okay,
Exactly.
okay. I didn't have any issues with topic one at all. I kind of thought this all seemed fairly, I mean, mostly it was just trying to clarify and tighten things up a little bit. So I was in favor of moving all forward. I guess, do we need to pull anything out before we move topic one forward?
I guess there's a question, does council support the code amendments? Yes. Was there anything that we would pull out, or was the discussion in general that you understand kind of what they want to bring back, and they'll bring back the details?
So can we move forward with a consensus
Do we have a
on
consensus, do we have a
on
consensus
topic one
on
to
that?
move forward with all the topics, or all the?
Looks like we do.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, just for clarity, are you interested in seeing that in ordinance form and a study session format before it comes before a public hearing? Would that help add some detail? Or a comfort level? Yeah,
I think that would be better,
great.
yeah.
That's what I want to check.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Great. So moving on, this one is related to the affordable housing strategy that was recently adopted. So the topic is reducing minimum parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing to align with recommendations in the affordable housing strategy. Right now, our parking requirements in the code do not contemplate various types of housing, so it's a catch-all. There's a current minimum of 1 parking space that's required per unit, up to a maximum of 2.5 spaces per unit. And then in other zone districts, that requirement can be even higher. Council was made aware in the affordable housing strategy adoption that building parking adds a considerable cost to developments, but particularly for affordable housing. And modifying parking minimums was identified as a recommended action item and immediate priority for council in that session. A single parking space can add tens of thousands of dollars per dwelling unit, and what we're finding with studies provided to us by the City and County of Denver and Foothills Regional Housing, a lot of parking is going unused. So essentially affordable housing developers are building parking that's not being used, sits vacant, and it becomes unneeded expenditures for those organizations. So staff is recommending a more nuanced and contemporary approach to parking regulations that considers the proximity of housing to transit resources and services. And what we found is that the mixed-use zone districts in the city and some other higher density residential zones are already in close proximity to transit corridors. So Wheat Ridge Ward Station, Wadsworth Boulevard, and 38th Avenue projects are either located right next to transit or bus lines. And they're also, at least 38th Avenue and Wadsworth, are located within walking distance to existing commercial centers and services. So currently, Wheat Ridge requires about 1 to 1.5 spaces per unit for all residential development. But Foothills Regional Housing, which is the Jefferson County Housing Authority, has found that there's an average utilization of only 0.29 vehicles per dwelling unit. So that's substantially less than 1 per unit. And in permanent supportive housing, so really low AMI or homeless housing, only 1 in 12 people actually have a car. So if Wheat Ridge required 1 space per unit, that means that potentially a large percentage, 70 to 90% of those spaces are not going to actually get used at all. Denver recently lowered their parking requirements for affordable housing to 0.1 space per unit citywide, and actually got rid of them altogether next to light rail. And even with our current adjustment process, the lowest we can go is 0.75 per unit. That's still more than double that average utilization rate. So this table in the staff report shows Denver's current requirements. Denver's are probably a little bit lower than more suburban communities, but Wheat Ridge's are really high compared to what Jefferson County is saying is actually getting used. So we're recommending following the recommendations in the adopted affordable housing strategy to reduce minimum parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing in both mixed-use and high-density residential zones. We don't have a number in mind right now and probably would want to bring this back for another study session. But the reason is we want to take a more market-based approach on parking and align with both Foothills Regional Housing and Denver recommendations to make Wheat Ridge a friendlier and more affordable place to develop affordable housing. It wouldn't eliminate the need for accessible parking spaces, so apartments still have to provide accessible parking spaces and loading areas. And these recommendations also align with our professional recommendations and national best practices. So Wheat Ridge's code is really out of alignment with kind of the leading edge of affordable housing production. So we've got a question at the end. Does council support reducing or removing minimum parking requirements for deed-restricted affordable housing? We are probably bringing that topic 1 back, so we can bring this back as well, but it makes sense to include in that code cleanup items amendment if council is supportive. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Ohm.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Scott, for that presentation. So a couple things. So I guess my first question is just, are we looking at the parking requirement that is next to, this is on page 6, the housing type? Are these all proposed, or is it just the deed restricted is what you're asking?
Our recommendation is focused specifically on deed-restricted affordable housing because that is defined as being tied to an AMI. That table is just what Denver's requirements are, which are probably more complex than what we're going, but they have a pretty big range based on both AMI and also unit type and age as well.
Because what I think is that, I mean, I definitely agree with like the shelters you're not going to have. It's going to be a really, really low rate, you know, and that kind of permanent supportive housing probably, the seniors 55 plus, that would be a really low number. The issue that I have is that I think we have to have another set of criteria besides just saying it's deed-restricted, you know. It's because we, you know, where's the house going to go, you know, and a lot of times, I mean, Wheat Ridge doesn't have a lot of land, and the same thing with like the 60% AMI. The other criteria, and this is what I'm thinking of too, I don't know how many in this room are familiar with Enterprise Green, if you guys have ever worked on affordable housing projects. But typically what happens is when a developer goes in to work on affordable housing, they want to get CHAFA funds, and CHAFA says you need to go through this Enterprise Green process. And the process is that there's points assigned for everything. and the points really kind of do have a kind of a monetary value. You can spend a lot of money to get 1 point, you can spend little money to get that same points. And so one of the criteria, and this is a mandatory criteria, and I'm just reading this verbatim, and I want this in the context of when we're deciding where we remove the parking, is it says, demonstrate that your project is within a 0.5 mile walk distance of at least 4 or a 1 mile walk distance of at least 7 resources identified below. And when I look at these resources, number 1 resource is food access, health and fitness, education and culture, mobility, so that's public transportation, bus stop, bike share, civic and community facilities, retail, services. The point is that, you know, we can't tell the developer, like, well, you put your project, you know, somewhere far away, you won't have to have any parking spaces, and then the residents have no transportation. They have no food sources, they have nothing. You know, so this has to really be, you know, I'm not saying what you're doing is, you know, a bad thing. I'm just saying that I want to have another layer to ensure that if we're gonna mandate like no parking, that, you know what, it's not a problem, because there's just a couple blocks from grocery stores or these other services where they have a rail stop, you know, so we have all these layers that makes sense. Does everybody kind of understand what I'm saying here? But this is a criteria that's mandatory for Enterprise Green. And so when you're doing this Enterprise Green checklist, and I've gone through these many times, that there's mandatory things you have to hit. And it just, what they want is they just want a good design that really fits for everybody, for equitable.
Thank you. Additional discussion, questions? Councilor Dozman, Councilor Nosler-Beck.
I just totally agree. I wasn't familiar with that criteria, but I think that if we're going to be limiting the parking spaces, we need to make sure that we're providing adequate transportation, like opportunities for transportation for our residents in some of these lower income residences. And one thing that I think that's also really important for us to consider is if it is, you know, access to grocery stores and some of those common, like, everyday needs, or to an RTD bus stop, or a light rail, that we have safe crossings for all of that, and sidewalks in place. And that, I know, would require a lot of infrastructure to go along with it. But I just think we can't, just because someone is in a space to be in an affordable housing unit, they should have safe, accessible transportation and access to all of the things they need.
Thanks. Can I respond to both of those comments, because I think they're really good. So we're focusing on mixed-use zones in the city, and all of our current mixed-use zones are on corridors where there's existing retail resources. So 38th Avenue between Sheridan and Wadsworth has grocery stores on both ends. It's served by frequent bus transit, and same with the Wadsworth corridor as well. We're not talking about areas that are not already served by transit or resources. It's really focused on our higher density corridors already, and mixed-use town center areas, not lower density neighborhoods.
If I could also add just to some clarity. So Denver has the highest volume of deed restricted housing, right, in the metro area, and also significantly more diverse urban fabric than we have. So they need a code that is this differentiated. I don't think we anticipate needing to have 5 different categories of deed restricted. We're not recommending 0. I think it'd be appropriate to acknowledge the Foothills Regional Housing's number, the 0.29, up to a 0.75. If our number landed somewhere in there for deed restricted affordable housing within a quarter mile of bus or transit, I think that's more the target that we had in mind. We don't want to be too forward in recommending that outright, but just if it helps in your minds in terms of what Scott says of where is affordable housing likely to be developed, and then just recognizing that we can probably capture it in a single category for our context, whereas Denver has to be a little more complicated.
I have Ms. Dozman and then Ms. Weaver.
Thank you. So just piggybacking off that, my comments would have been that I wouldn't want to drop below that .29 that Foothills Regional Housing is seeing as their average. And I'm comfortable with doing this within the mixed-use neighborhood along the corridors, because I think we do have more transportation opportunities in those areas, as do we want to attract, more housing along those corridors. And I know the Foothills Regional Housing has purchased that Pep Boys, and so we're kind of forward-thinking and utilizing that space to the capacity that possible. I'm glad to hear that you say we wouldn't recommend 0 spaces, because I think that our residents would kind of go nuts over that. And then as far as just the other deed restricted affordable housing, Denver differentiates between, 0.75 down to 0.25. And considering that we're only within mixed use neighborhood and not other residential areas, that's only when I would start to kind of have qualms with like this 0.75, because I think single family homes have to have at least 1 to 2 parking spots designated, even if it's deed restricted. But we'll cross that bridge if it comes.
Thank you. Councilor Weaver.
Thanks so much for just providing all this research. I'm just curious, is there an equivalent space in another large western city that Wheat Ridge is similar to? Because I realize we're getting this data from Foothills, which is important, but I was just kind of curious if there's a comparable suburban area that is, I'm thinking of Phoenix or in LA, or where we can really say, is our homeless population truly non-mobile? If that does that make sense? In that the face of homelessness can look a little bit different as you move farther out from a city center. And people often are then living in cars and things like that. And so I was just kind of curious if that number is reflective generally of western suburban.
We haven't looked at other metro areas. I think there is well-established correlation between discretionary income and vehicle ownership rates. That's
Certainly.
often a census data point that we
Certainly.
can look up.
Yeah.
We can also go, and there's several major housing authorities in the metro area, Metro West and Denver Housing Authority. We can ask them to do similar data, or ask for their data, the way that Foothills Regional Housing provided it to us. They gave it to us because they're in the act of trying to get entitlements, and right now our code is not flexible, and we expressed as much. But we can certainly seek out some other data points. To that
Yeah,
end.
I'm just more thinking about, oftentimes we sort of consolidate all metropolitan areas together, and I think western metropolitan areas is certainly different than eastern metropolitan areas. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think, kind of piggybacking off of Scott's point, but maybe making the inverse point, they get points for being closer to those places, right? So they get more points for being closer to food and to transportation, and I think that's where people are going to build this stuff. We're talking about 44th and Wadsworth right now, which is right on 2 major transit lines. So I think dropping down to 0.75, 0.5 even probably makes sense. So it's still kind of double, it sounds like, from what Foothills is seeing right now. I don't think we should drop down to 0.25 or 0.29, just because I do think our residents are going to start worrying about people parking in their neighborhoods and that sort of thing. So so I would definitely kind of support that if it came back, 0.5, 0.75 for those sorts of developments. So thank you.
Councilor Nosler-Beck.
Lauren or Scott, could one of you just kind of explain how .29 parking spaces would work in like a mixed use development? Because I don't know what .29 of a parking spot, how that would work in my life, and I just that would help me, I think, wrap my head around it.
So I guess if there's 3 units, like apartments, you would only have to provide 1 parking space and then whoever has the car gets that space. So not every apartment will have its assigned parking space, essentially. And that's because Foothills Regional Housing, which is all of Jefferson County, so more suburban than Wheat Ridge in a lot of places, has said only 1 in 3 of our residents in affordable housing has or uses a parking space. And so if there's 3 apartments, only 1 of those residents will have a car, and it will only be 1 car.
And then and it sounds like there will be, like ADA, like accessible spots. And then they would also be required, you said like loading, but like would there be like visitor parking or something that we could like work into the 0.29? Just because they're like, I think about a family situation that I have that like they're seniors, they don't have cars, they're not mobile, but we visit. And so we would be in the neighborhood, you know?
Yeah, that could be built into the requirement. I believe, but I'm not certain that 0.29 includes, like, accounts for sort of visitor parking. A lot of cities don't have any visitor parking requirements. Like, the number is the number. Wheat Ridge is actually relatively unique in that we already have some mandates for visitor parking. But yeah, that's something we would consider when landing on a final number, is requiring visitor parking as well.
I think that would be I would like to see something like that, at least some options.
Councilor Rome.
Yeah, I would just second that, that last statement, that, I'd like to see some data just on the visitor. Because it is, I want to try to be as progressive and equitable to everybody, but at the end of the day, if you do want to visit somebody, it's like, well, where are we supposed to go? I know in Denver, a while back, they actually had, I think, they allowed some of these slot homes to have 0 parking. And it's not for everyone, but I don't know what happens, I guess, when you try to visit those areas, which I have, and I think I ended up just saying, like, you know, I just need to either Uber or take the bus because there's just such a lack of parking. And at some point you do need to make a decision of, you know, and apart from visiting, just, you know, these projects in general, if they're in an area where maybe it is a little urban and you do want to visit, but there's just no parking, and if it's not close to the TOD, sometimes people just stop going there, which is kind of unfortunate, but I do agree with your statements. Thank you.
Councilor Weaver.
I just want to be supportive of everything that's been said. I agree with the visitor. I tend to agree more with Mr. Stites regarding 0.5 or 0.75. I can't, coming from a rural area where homelessness looked a little different, it looked like a car ownership for people. And I'm having a hard time seeing Wheat Ridge for us going down to 0.29, only because I would hate to have a family situation give up a car or feel like they had to give up their one possession because of these minimums. So that's only my point in sort of getting a little bit more research on exactly what the suburban homeless population would look like here. Thanks.
Thank you. Scott, are we looking at this primarily or only in the MUN and MUC districts, or also in the higher density residential zones?
I think that's probably something we'd want to bring back to council. It's primarily the mixed-use districts, which includes the TOD area.
Right.
There are some existing Foothills Regional Housing properties in the R3 zone district that are fairly close to Kipling, which probably should be included in this as well, but those are existing versus new. Okay. So that's why I expanded it a little bit to include that.
Okay. And then you talk about, and maybe this is only in relationship to Denver, low density, medium density, and high density. Are those concepts that we would look to have a definition for?
No, I don't believe so. That was really just showing that Denver has pretty low parking requirements even in their more suburban zones than Wheat Ridge. So 0.75 per unit for a very suburban affordable housing project.
When you look, and kind of just anecdotally, you look at the housing that's been built over around the Tennyson Street project, and, you know, the reason I have a parking lot at my restaurant is because to go to, you know, to go to Tennyson or areas around there, you drop your wife off and say, I'll drive around and find a place to park, and then I'll come and join you, you know?
And ironically, those all have two-car garages, so they actually do have parking for each unit there. It's the commercial
Yeah.
parking becomes the challenge.
But I know that's always going to be you know, a fear because, you know, and I've lived in East Denver, and it's, you know, it's the same way, so. Additional, Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you. Yeah, when we're talking affordable housing, are we also talking housing for the homeless?
I don't think so. So we would, if we move forward with a code amendment that says it's for deed restricted affordable housing, we need to define what that means. It is usually going to be income qualified permanent housing, either an apartment or a home. Housing for the homeless tends to be in a more transient nature, so that's not a part of this code amendment for us. I know it shows up in Denver's table as shelters, but not something we're talking about right now.
Okay. And I got a hold of Highlands West, the high-rise senior apartments A, and I asked about parking there. They do allow one parking space for apartments. Not everybody drives there, but they do have spaces to park. They have visitor parking. And if you go through there, the parking lot's pretty full. So they have a bus stop right out there too, you know, so the idea that if you're older or whatever, you're not driving is not true. Maybe they shouldn't be, but I don't know. But when we're talking affordable housing, are we also talking at all about Section 8?
So Section 8 is a housing voucher program which subsidizes people's rents, so that, and Section 8 housing vouchers are not unit specific, so they are person specific. So the only reason that that's somewhat related is that you have to be income qualified for a housing voucher to subsidize your rent, but what we are talking about is a physical building that has often a 15 to 40-year deed restriction. So it's not, Section 8 may supplement somebody's rent in that structure, but it's something that has a recorded deed restriction, which the housing vouchers don't.
And they do have Section 8 at Highlands West?
Yes.
And as far as parking goes, like anybody else who's in the apartments, it's first come, first serve, wherever you want to park. But if you would be Section 8 and you would need help, like for ADA or whatever, then they have assigned parking.
Okay.
So that's another thing about affordable housing is there might be people who need to have access, you know, to their vehicle. Maybe they can't walk 4 blocks to the bus, but they can get in the car, they got a walker, and they can drive, you know. So parking, I think, still is important.
That project is a good example. So that was actually originally approved in this, I think, 80s as a planned development. And so it doesn't meet today's current requirements. It's not parked at one space per unit. And so I'm glad you called them because we probably could do a little homework on what are some of our pre-existing deed-restricted affordable units and what are their ratios. We did not do that. We did not make that call yet. And they got rezoned, I believe, to mixed-use neighborhood when we did the corridor-wide rezoning. So we have a lot of legally non-conforming deed-restricted affordable units today that probably have less parking than the code currently requires.
Caesar
they
Square is another example
good
too.
example.
I mean,
Yeah.
and Foothills may have data on their utilization rate, but I mean, across Jefferson County, it's still that really low 0.29 per unit.
And they said not the majority of people do drive, but the parking lot is still full. I mean,
Right.
that's a huge place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Counselor Stites, or Counselor Ohm, excuse me, and then Counselor Dozman.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a question for staff. First, I'll just have a comment. I had the pleasure with the mayor and Patrick back in December meeting with Dr. Carrie Makerwicz with CU. And what was really interesting about her presentation was that she had all this data analysis of like how many people were leaving Jefferson County and traveling out, or people coming into, so you could just kind of see like how many people are actually working in a certain area. And I don't know if you've if staff has, Florin or Scott, if you're aware of that, that presentation or that data, but I found it really interesting just to kind of have an understanding, like, are people generally staying in Wheat Ridge, that are on, if they were deed restricted, or would they be traveling far away? I don't know. But if you need more information on that, contact, I'd be more than happy to share that.
Thanks.
Councilor Dozman.
Thank you. So my thoughts just went to the Howard Johnson and that affordable housing project that's going to be underway. So in the event that they start development, but they don't yet, we haven't yet enacted this, would they be able to, at a later time, reapply for this kind of variance or update in their project?
The Howard Johnson's a good question, because in a future phase, they would like to potentially use some of that open parking lot area for commercial. So the amount of required parking would dictate how much they could remove for commercial. So it could have an impact on sort of what the future of that site looks like, yes.
But they're not going to be deed restricted affordable. If you remember, they're going to be naturally affordable, I think is what they're calling it, just because they're going to be smaller renovated motel rooms. So they're not going to be deed restricted, though.
Okay, item number 2, staff is asking if we want them to bring back revised parking requirements and reduce minimum requirements with respect to deed restricted affordable housing. And we do. So that's it. Okay. And number 1 was okay. Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Last topic for mixed use, and then we'll go to subdivision. This is related to parking requirements for commercial corridors, specifically for changes in use of existing buildings that were built before city incorporation. So that sounds like a lot, but it's really saying we have a lot of old commercial buildings on our corridors, especially 38th and 29th, that do not have any parking. And what's happening is that people are really interested in reinvesting in those buildings, but our parking requirements kick in when there's a change of use. So a lot of times what's happening is these buildings, someone is interested in adding a cafe or retail space, and they're not able to because they're not able to provide parking on site without demolishing the building or demolishing part of the building, or going out to the community and seeing if someone is willing to lease them parking in a shared parking situation. And so what's happening is people are walking away from those properties and not reinvesting. That sounds pretty harsh, but it's true, and we've dealt with a lot of variance requests where people are trying to come in because they've tried all other options of pursuing shared parking or trying to accommodate parking on site. And it really does represent a huge barrier to reuse of aging commercial buildings, especially on those corridors like 29th, 38th, and 44th. So a lot of other cities have actually established some very narrow exceptions to parking requirements where they're understanding that buildings built before a certain time are very unlikely to have parking. Denver has theirs at 1967, so they do not require parking for changes of use, which means reinvestment in buildings built prior to 1967, because it would be impossible. Nothing would ever be able to go into those buildings in Denver. And that's happening in Wheat Ridge too, on 38th Avenue particularly, but we've also seen it on 29th. So we're recommending this as well in the code amendment, which aligns with the goals in the neighborhood revitalization strategy and the intent of the mixed-use code to be flexible and promote reinvestment, and this will really encourage reinvestment in aging properties as well. It would really be one less barrier to business owners attempting to reinvest in these aging commercial properties. That said, current parking requirements would still be assessed for any new development, and they'd also be assessed for additions. So in a lot of places, like, you probably wouldn't be able to add on to an old building without providing additional parking. So it's really for that specific use case of there's a building, someone wants to convert it into restaurant or retail that's vacant right now, and not requiring additional parking to be built would really help those allowed to move forward a little bit more easily. So the question is, does council support removing those requirements in that specific case? And in this case, we're recommending before the city's incorporation. It's a clean date, and we recognize that most of our commercial buildings on 38th that are historic in nature and are vacant are built before 1969.
Discussion? Counselor Weaver.
Thank you. I was just curious, can we specifically identify, like, the corridor of buildings? Because there's a lot of things that were built before, before what, 1969 is when we incorporated?
Yep.
And some of them do have appropriate parking. I guess let me see if, sorry, that idea came out kind of half-baked. I'm wondering if we can identify specific corridors, then rather just saying all of 38th or all of 29th. I also think that we might want to consider, you know, like on 38th, is there some shared parking with the new park space? Are there other places we can identify that can absorb this parking at different times of the day, so that we have a place? Because I can also see what happened when I lived in the Highlands was same thing happened. Lots of great restaurants came in. Impossible to find a parking place even in front of your own house, as these restaurants were extremely popular on every night of the week. So just trying to think of where, other than going into neighborhoods, where we can identify some of that overflow parking that can be shared. Thanks.
Counselor Ullman, then Counselor Nosler-Beck, and then Counselor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. So one question I have is, so if you had, if you had a building and it was built before incorporation and it had very little parking, and the developer said, I want to make this, not a really big building, but I want to make this into a museum. A museum would have a high rate of parking required, correct? As opposed to just a straight out. And I say this because I actually had a client in Wheat Ridge that they wanted to do just that. They back 10, 15 years ago. And so I foresee a problem because they just didn't have enough parking. And I told that specific client that it wasn't a great site to work with. But how would you address that if that came up? Would you?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. Number one, we would have loved to map this since the outage. We still don't have our mapping abilities back, so it will be a very quick sort of visual aid at some point to show you all the buildings prior to 1969 and where we have parking. We can definitely do that. The mid-mood mod, the house, right? Yep. It's Wadsworth and like 40-something. Yeah, I remember that too. So they have space for some parking, right? And I think the intent here would be not to just sort of waive it entirely, but to say to the extent that you cannot meet the code requirement, we can provide categorical relief to this set of buildings that is older. A more recent example is Stylus and Crate really struggled to repurpose the dentist's office to be the coffee shop because they have just those 2 or 3, right? And we were like, well, you got to have an ADA parking spot, but you're supposed to have 5 parking spots, whatever it was. It's really challenging. So you're right, we could look at it from a land use standpoint and say, like, restaurants get a free pass because you tend to be more of a sales tax generator than a museum. We can be that detailed if we want to, but I think generally the reason that we're bringing it up is that when we start offering variances to people over and over, we look for a pattern, and that's when we say the code is probably broken because we've offered this in the similar fact pattern 6, 7, 8 times over the last couple of years. Yeah. So it's not an easy conversation. We know parking is very sensitive, and it may be that it needs to be more of a geographic overlay where Wadsworth you couldn't park, on the street, but 38th we have on-street parking, and we can take a finer tooth comb to this. But that's maybe some more of the context from which we're looking at.
Okay. I trust staff. I trust you guys. I have every confidence that you'll come up with a solution. So, Thank you.
I would add that that's probably one of the number one concerns of people trying to reinvest in old buildings is, am I going to have to provide parking? And am I going to have to talk to my neighbor who is not going to be willing to share their parking lot with me. And that really, it causes a lot of people to walk away from these otherwise amazing buildings.
Councilor Nosler-Beck.
I just remember us like talking about parking when we were discussing the 44th Avenue sub-area plan, and I know that we have a lot of different types of corridors in the city, but with Wheat Ridge being you know, a part of kind of the boom in the 50s and 60s when everybody was really excited to be able to drive their car places. There are a lot of, at least along the western part of the 44th Avenue corridor, where there's a lot of parking in front of businesses that don't necessarily need that many spaces. And then on 38th or in the eastern side of 44th, you end up with not enough spaces. And I just wonder if we can think about it creatively and take some solutions to business owners, current business owners, to talk about like what they're willing to work with in terms of making some public parking space, like lots available. I realize that's not something for the zoning code, but I just, as you were talking about trends that we keep bringing up, we're bringing this up a couple of times now and talking about the same thing. So just want to put that out there, that I think there is a need for some shared public parking spaces in our corridors.
Thank you. Councilor Hutchinson.
Yes, addressing parking, I know 38th and Newland, that area where there's the bike shop and a barber shop and Bardo's and all that, they're parking in the neighborhoods, and it's really bothering neighbors to have cars that are in front of their houses blocking the driveways and things like that. It is a real problem, and it makes me wonder, like, where the Bradley gas station was. You know, what we don't have here in Wheat Ridge is what Arvada and Golden does have. It's parking lots where people can park and then they can walk to the business or whatever like that. So we don't, as a city, have that available. And so, you know, with the streets being narrower and on 38th, you can't park on there the whole way, and, you know, only parts of it. And it's very difficult to come from a side street to try to get onto 38th when a car is just parked, you know, right close to that side street. So, I mean, that's just something out there. How come we don't have parking lots like the other cities when we are always talking about what the other cities do?
Really never needed them.
Now we do.
You know, I think we kind of joke with staff. It's like, I think we know we're successful in Wheat Ridge attracting business when we have a parking problem, right? And I think we're starting to talk about that some more and more. We do have 2 city parking lots on 38th Avenue, Judy. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but there's one right next to what the former Right Coast Pizza, and then there's one further east across from, it's where we stage for the Carnation Festival Parade every year, Ames and 38th. It's right by a framing shop. So it's adjacent to 38th and Ames. It's on that corner. But, you know, those are all, and I don't know if that one gets used by, I think, that business down there mainly. But you're right, we don't have city parking lots because I don't think they were ever needed in the past, but I think we are starting to see that there's more and more potential parking issues.
We were out in the country. Mayor Pro Tem Stites, and then Councilor Dozman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just off of Judy's question, who owns that parking garage that was built by the light rail station in Arvada? Is it Arvada? Is it RTD or?
It's RTD's
Is RTD.
parking garage. Arvada participated with it. They contributed some funding to it because I think they made it bigger than when the RTD was going to.
Okay, well, that might be something we look at
Yeah.
at another point, but I was just, when you brought up Stylus and Crate, it reminded me of a conversation that my dad, my grandfather, and I had in the lobby at BNF Tire Company at one point about that building, because, you know, we were talking about parking spaces and there was the city code so that did prohibit quite a bit of reinvestment into that corridor for a long period of time because there's only so much parking. So if you want to build a coffee shop, you want to build a restaurant, and I assume Tad probably got away with it by partnering with Eugene, and is that
Got creative. Yeah, you can, that code does include the ability to share. It also includes the ability to count the immediately, or parking within a certain pedestrian distance, assuming safe crossings. It's actually part of the reason hopefully the 38th and Reed pedestrian signal will help make parking a little more flexible because we'll gain access to the north side. There's a few provisions we can patchwork together, but it takes a lot more time and it's more unpredictable, I think, than many of the people who looked at that building were interested in.
Well, and there's also parking at Stevens too, right? Like especially on the weekends and
Yeah.
in the evenings. So
Right.
I would be in favor of moving forward with this. I do think we need to do this carefully though, because if we just say park wherever you want and, you know, build whatever you want, we're going to have some issues. But I think, like Scott said, I have faith that the staff will massage this and make it work. But it would be nice to use some of those buildings that are sitting vacant or underutilized, I guess, to draw a little bit more sales tax in. And, you know, if it's literally just a parking requirement, then we should probably look into that. So thank you.
Counselor Dozman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So on these sites, if it were a scrape and build, would that trigger a new development or would that be considered infill?
That would require new parking requirements for new buildings.
Okay, and so at what percentage is that enacted? Like, if, say they repurposed some of it, but then scraped the majority?
Usually we consider something new development if it's a major addition or a scrape. But if it's just someone that wants to remodel an existing building but not add on to it, then that's kind of what we're recommending.
So this would be more of an incentive to keep buildings that are there rather than to tear them down and build new buildings.
Essentially, yes. It's really, I mean, there's a lot of vacant commercial space, and so it would reduce one barrier to get people back into those spaces.
Right. I'm gonna see if we have a consensus. I'm gonna go back out on a limb and say, rather than council supports removing minimum requirements to maybe revising minimum requirements. And with that, would we have consensus to move this forward? Okay. That would be revised. Okay. Working hard.
Moving on. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Article 4 of the zoning code, which is the subdivision code. And these were last comprehensively reviewed in 2014, where the city actually repealed and reenacted this section with a totally new version. And since 2014, we've had a lot of lessons learned. We've processed, as a department, 125 subdivision applications. And of those, 41 required review from Planning Commission and City Council, so major subdivisions. 13 required review from Planning Commission only, and then the remaining 71 were reviewed administratively. And I'll get into why that matters in just a bit. But we do go to a lot of public hearings for subdivisions. So in addition to updates needed to address affordable housing, the other recommendations within the section seek to modernize portions of the code to provide clarity and to establish consistent public improvement requirements and to simplify the process where feasible. So I'm sure everyone knows what a subdivision is at this point, but it is the creation or reconfiguration of lots, tracts, or parcels for the purpose of sale or development. We've also been seeing an increasing amount of subdivisions to clean up title or ownership issues, and I'll get into that in just a minute. They are technical documents that are non-discretionary, and that means they don't change zoning or permitted uses. They instead prepare land for development for uses already permitted by the underlying zoning. And in a lot of cases, it's also defining utility easements, access easements, and drainage easements, and it can also dedicate or vacate right-of-way. So the 2014 update did simplify review procedures a little bit, which relied upon public hearings for almost all types of subdivisions. And then the 2014 update still relies on public hearings, but did expand administrative review to subdivisions up to 3 lots. And then since 2014, we have looked at, there were some minor updates to the subdivision code, including as recently as, I guess, a couple months ago with the race and religion-based covenants. But the code has not been reviewed as a whole since 2014. And 125 subdivisions later, we definitely have some lessons learned from how that code is being administered. So I will start out with topic 1, which is another recommendation of the deed restricted affordable housing, the affordable housing strategy, which is the waiver of parkland dedication fees. So our current parkland dedication requirement is established by the subdivision code, and it's applied to all residential projects within the city. Developers either dedicate public parkland on site or they pay a fee in lieu of dedication, and the vast majority of sites would not have practical dedications, so the city is requiring them to pay the fee in lieu. Currently, only ADUs and nursing homes are exempt from the parkland dedication requirement. And it's assessed based on the density factor, which acknowledges different household sizes and impacts. So right now, the standard fee is about $2,500 per unit. And then projects located within an urban renewal area, which includes 38th Avenue or mixed-use development, pays about $2,000 per unit. And there's currently no exemptions or fee waivers for deed-restricted affordable housing in the code. And these are defined, we talked about this a little earlier, as units that have agreements recorded against the property which limits the rent or sales price based on income. So this is a pretty real example, but a 50-unit affordable housing building would then be required to pay $101,000 just in parkland fees under the current model. So the affordable housing strategy, specifically page 52, called out fee waivers or reductions for projects with an affordable component. And these fees are actually relatively small in the, I guess in the scheme of things. Development of apartment buildings is really expensive, but the recommendation was still made in the affordable housing strategy because any contribution to reducing affordable housing prices can help shrink the gaps and encourage production. So we are recommending waiving the parkland dedication fee and requirement in whole to reduce the burden of deed-restricted affordable housing in Wheat Ridge. The reason for this, and the reason why we're recommending it go away entirely for deed-restricted affordable housing, is the park system is now largely built out, and fees in lieu are really being used to supplement existing assets. And the proposed fee waiver would not have a negative impact on the system of parks and trails. The total amount of affordable housing is a pretty small percentage of all housing that's being built. And just to clarify, in a project consisting of both deed-restricted affordable housing and market rate units, the fee reduction would only apply to those deed-restricted units. So our question to council is if you all support a waiver to parkland fees for deed-restricted affordable housing.
Thank you. Councilor Weaver.
My question is for both of you, that I realize it's sort of separate from this, but in deed-restricted type situations, whether it's higher density or lower density, is there a requirement for public space for those residents? Because I'm just wondering, as the units are getting smaller and all of these different things, while I realize a building isn't going to necessarily create its own park, what are the requirements for the different types of communities? Does that make sense? For either inside or outside public space for people to hang out together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. All of our mixed-use zone districts require some sort of open space. It can range on percentage of the site, but they have to be built to encourage like gathering space, so like a plaza, gazebo area. We've seen some creative detention pond areas can get repurposed into actual open space areas. But there is a requirement, all sites have to provide it. There's no exception.
So this is totally separate than that?
Yeah.
That's what my question was.
And
Thank
that's
you
like
so
a
much.
private, it would be for those residents only.
Right,
But it's
right.
still amenity space it's required to be on site, yeah.
I appreciate that, thank you.
Counselor Ohm.
So, I think, so you're saying that they would have to provide some private space on the property?
Yes, that's a current requirement too, so nothing would be changing there.
And how much space would they have to provide per unit? What is that, like square footage?
So depending on the zoning or the location, all residential, multi-unit residential projects, deed restricted or not, are required to provide between 10 and 30% of the lot area as open space. The parkland dedication requirement and fee in lieu is a completely separate requirement. So
'Cause
it's over and above. And I should further add, we sometimes say like, hey, if I give you over my percent maximum, can you reduce my fee? They are like they live in totally separate worlds. You cannot offset one by the other.
But the whole premise of the dedicated fee was to either create a park, right, or to improve that park.
Yeah, so yeah, theoretically, yes. When the rule first came into place, it was to create parks. And in Greenland, or Greenfield development, like Thornton, it is to make sure your park system is growing commensurate with your population growth. When we changed the code, we did that because there was a provision that said every developer can request a waiver from the Planning Commission and Parks Commission, and every single one did. So it was very inconsistent in how we were getting any parkland dedication or fee. So instead, we said, here's what we'll do. We will reduce this fee significantly. Like, it's not even close to market rate in terms of we're not taking that money and then go buying land. That's just not the intent. So the intent has long been, we're landlocked. Our Parks Master Plan says we're doing pretty well, acreage to population, but we could afford to sort of continue to invest based on the changing needs and demands of our population and of our park system. So our fee is not intended or calibrated to be buying more land. It's really to be investing in land. I'm gonna forget the ratio. It's like 7.5 acres per 1,000 people is the goal of our community, and we've pretty much hit that. So we are very open to developers who are like, why do I have to pay $100,000? We're not buying parks for that. We're just sort of investing in the infrastructure we have to keep up with the usage demand. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that helps. I was just looking at the enterprise green criteria again, and they talked about how having developments within a quarter acre of a park. And I think that's kind of what I saw in that staff report, that, you know, we do have some parks that are in close proximity, or also having, like enterprise green, say like a half mile to some type of like access, say a bike trail.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to think of, you know, if there was a development, where would it go? How far from a park? Because unfortunately what happens is, even though the city requires that certain percentage of open space, a lot of times what I see is that what's left over is what usually can't be built. And so it might be a detention or something like that. And it's like, yes, it's technically check the box open space, but it's not very usable. And then, you know, residents or somebody else might say, well, you're not providing the fee for the park. And what I'm saying is, if we had the justification of like, well, the park's a quarter mile away, they can walk to it, or they can, you know, they can get on a trail and they can have access to it. I think that's easier for people to understand that and digest.
Yeah, I don't remember the number. We exceed sort of the national average of the percent of our population living within like 10 minutes of a park. Our recommendation here is strictly to sort of help the bottom line of a deed restricted affordable project.
Additional questions? Oh, Mayor Pro Tem Stites?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I was going to make a similar point, I guess. I think Wheat Ridge has 23 or 29 parks. Parks. And I think and this is probably a better question for Karen, but I think the goal was, like when we invested in Color Strand, was that there was a park within walking distance of every neighborhood, or within 5 minutes.
And
or
that's
something.
one neighborhood where we're lacking, and that's why we put some money into Color Strand.
But I think the goal
Yep.
was like within 5
Yeah.
minutes,
Yep.
or within walking
10, yep.
distance of, yeah. So, you know, I think getting rid of this requirement, you know, almost anywhere they're gonna build in the city of Wheat Ridge, they're gonna find a park within walking distance, and you're not, and like I think to Mr. Cutler's point, they're not gonna put so much wear and tear on the parks that they're gonna need the $100,000 worth of whatever to go into it. So I would definitely support this. It just helps the bottom line. So that's what we're trying to do, right?
Thank you. I've got a question more in a general sense. Now we're talking about deed-restricted properties. How does the city understand that the restriction is carried out in practice?
Yeah, most deed restricted properties that we have are because they were LIHTC projects, so low-income housing tax credit projects, which are executed usually through CHAFA, which is the Colorado Housing
Finance
Plan.
Authority.
Thank you. So we would require that they demonstrate that documentation to us, and it's CHAFA who's typically the one who's regulating the enforcement of that deed restriction. Now, if we start to dabble here in the coming years, hire a housing staff person, deed restrict projects through a naturally occurring affordable housing, we would take some of that regulatory authority on, but we will have that conversation with this group when we get there. Where we see this most likely applying, because a park fee does not apply to an existing unit, you get a credit for that, is going to be in those bigger projects that tend to be like a LIHTC project.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would we, take Fruitdale, for example. We have about 5 or 6
Yep.
deed-restricted
Yes.
rental units.
Mhm.
Do we know that, or how would we know that on a year-to-year basis, and they've turned over 6 times to new tenants,
Yes.
that those new tenants qualify for the apartment?
Yeah, so any project with deed restriction has somebody who's monitoring compliance. In the case of Fruitdale, it's the county. Jefferson County utilized their home funds, the HUD funds, and that is where the deed restriction comes from. So we could call them anytime or periodically or annually and confirm that, but they're the ones monitoring that compliance.
So do you see a situation where we would want to start tracking deed-restricted properties in Wheat Ridge?
Yes.
And so we would be sort of monitoring those on an annual basis?
Yes, yeah, I do.
Any further questions? The question, does council want to support a waiver of dedicated parkland for permanently affordable housing? Looks like we do. That sounds good. We're now an hour and a half in. Do we want to keep going now? Do we want to take a break? Or we've got another 2 or 3 pages. Keep moving forward.
We're past halfway.
Okay. Mr. Cutler.
All right. Next topic is similar to the mixed use section, where we just need to update the code for consistency and clarity. We have a lot of incorrect, outdated cross-references. We have lack of modern terminology, and then we actually have some sections not in the subdivision code that conflict with the current subdivision regulations. So we are proposing in one fell swoop to amend all of those at the same time, essentially to modernize the code. Just some examples. We don't have any reference to the internet in utilities, which just feels like a little bit of an oversight.
What is that?
We don't have any reference to parkland fees being due at time of building permit. This was actually missed during Ordinance 1693, which made that a requirement. We don't have any clarity when homeowners associations or party wall agreements are required. And we actually reached out to our city attorney on this one. We have really vague requirements in the code about HOAs. And according to our attorney, HOAs are necessary when there are common elements within a subdivision boundary. So private alley, private detention pond, shared open space. We have historically required an HOA, but we need to point to a place in the code that actually requires it, because we've gotten a lot of pushback from developers of saying, well, we have common elements, but I don't want to have an HOA, but we have no way of knowing how those common areas are ever going to get maintained. We also have a section in not the subdivision code which conflicts with current subdivision requirements. I won't get into too much detail, but it's a vestige of our old code, which basically said everything goes to Planning Commission and City Council. It has not been enforced since 2014 when we redid our subdivision code based on the number of lots that go to public hearings, and we're recommending we remove that altogether. We also have the need to clarify policies regarding consolidation plots, and that's when someone is building a house on a single lot. A lot of times in East Wheat Ridge, there are a bunch of property lines that are running everywhere throughout the lot. A lot of times they were platted essentially in 25-foot segments, and someone will own two. And the line basically splits the house down the middle. And we're proposing essentially an easier way to facilitate redevelopment on those properties that don't require every single person to replat. There's already something called a property merger covenant that allows you to essentially remove that lot line and hold both properties as one. And then lastly, we need to update our application checklist. This is surprisingly codified, which I didn't actually know until looking at this. But it includes minimum submittal requirements. We have reference to paper copies. We also just have reference to things we don't feel are necessary in the application process. And we also need to include some new things in that application checklist as well. So I won't get into the specifics unless you want me to, but this list essentially is it. But we just need to modernize the code.
Okay, code cleanup questions. I had one. What is a party wall agreement?
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So we see a party wall agreement is required when two people have a shared common wall, so duplex, townhomes. In some communities, Denver, namely, they have allowed folks to have an agreement that just says, we acknowledge that we have shared facilities. The difference between a party wall and agreement and an HOA is that there are different rights, and party wall agreements don't have a funding mechanism. So our biggest concern is, like, if I require you to build a detention pond, you're going to have to maintain it, and you need to have a funding mechanism to do that. So we have not historically allowed a party wall agreement in Wheat Ridge. But increasingly, we see developers who want to do that because it's a lot easier for them to draft a couple-page party wall agreement than to create an HOA. Yeah.
And special districts are sort of another type of, in
Yep.
lieu of an HOA.
Yes, that's a good, so if you think of this as a spectrum, party wall agreement is sort of the lowest end, HOA is probably next, a special district or metro district would be the next level up, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, do we want to have staff come back with code amendments that mention the internet and other items? We do. Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate that.
Particularly fiber optic internet. So.
I'm sure in 10 years we'll have some new technology we have to put back in the code. We have no idea. I'm kind of surprised it was missed in 2014, but you know.
Okay, Scott, topic 3.
Thanks. So kind of related to that, we need to clarify utility undergrounding requirements, which is not the most exciting topic, but we have a lot of new development, a lot of infill development, and we have a lot of existing overhead facilities, which include cable, phone, and electricity. And the only mention in the subdivision code right now states that all new utilities need to be placed underground. And this sounds really simple, but in practice, it's actually really confusing with developers and staff. Some take that to mean that only new services have to be placed underground, but the existing facilities can remain above ground. We've actually historically interpreted this, going back to 2014 at least, that means anytime there's new redevelopment and they're adding facilities to those lines, they need to go underground. This is actually challenging to administer because of the way the code is written. And we're also aware that requiring underground utilities everywhere along the frontage of a subdivision might have disproportionate effects. So, for example, a small 2-lot subdivision, you're only building 2 houses, and you have to underground the utilities in front of that property, but the pole is actually 100 feet away from the property. So there's this spillover effect where it may require utility work well beyond the frontage of the property. And there's nowhere in the code to clarify how the city should enforce these requirements. And there's no consideration for exemptions or waivers. The only waiver right now is that major distribution lines and transformers can be above ground, and that's those really big power lines, but really no other examples for waivers in our code. lot of other communities have much more detailed code requirements, and we've actually consulted with the Public Works Director on this to get some guidance. We don't have enough detail right now, but basically we're seeking policy direction to say, I guess, one, does council have the desire to underground utilities on all streets or just key corridors? Do we want to have waiver considerations for undergrounding in cases where it might be economically infeasible or deter development altogether? And what we're asking for is, do we have the direction to review other cities' policies regarding what is required? And then are there any specific priorities for council?
Thank you. Councilor Dozeman.
Thank you. So I know that we're talking about the subdivision code, but could we also apply this to accessory dwelling units? I know that some residents that had non-conforming lots that had at one point wanted to do an accessory dwelling unit, undergrounding utilities or creating new utilities was a big hindrance. So would this be applicable to them in a sense as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when you're requesting new service lines for something like a new ADU, that we don't have jurisdiction over that, so Excel will dictate that. I mean, ideally, I think Excel wants everything underground because it's not impacted by storms and accidents. The way that we apply this is to new development, multi-unit, commercial, or multiple single-unit homes, or to subdivision. So we have not applied this rule to ADUs.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
And so, okay, thank you.
Sorry.
So it just, in that respect, it could be easier for somebody with a non-conforming lot with a second home to subdivide as opposed to go through the ADU process, theoretically.
Yes, so yes, that's the short answer.
Councilor Rome.
Thank you, Mayor. So my question is if you had, say, two small residential lots, and those two small residential lots are equal length to one commercial lot, currently, what is the code for a commercial lot for undergrounding?
The code just says all new utilities need to be placed underground, and that's it.
So irregardless of this, for the subdivision, the commercial would still have to do it even though it's the same length?
Correct. Yeah.
I feel like it should just be the same. It should be equitable. You know, if we're going to require for the commercial, it's 150 feet, and you got two lots and they equal 150 feet, then it should be the same. Or, we should do it or we don't do it. But it should, I think it should be the same, because then you have the issue of like, well, the small business owner is trying to do some infill and it's a money issue. I mean, I guess what's the reason that we want to underground? Is it, I understand Excel saying like, hey, this is what we require, but is the city doing it as kind of a good neighbor to Excel? Is it for aesthetics? Is this how we update infrastructure over time?
So most typically, I think, and we haven't done a comprehensive sort of summary of other communities, but typically you would see cities want to underground for aesthetic reasons on main corridors. I think Excel's primary reason is probably, I'm looking at our Excel colleague in the room, is because it sort of protects the infrastructure. But usually when it's a public policy for the city, it's aesthetics. The challenge is that the frontage, like two houses that are the same width and a commercial unit that's the same width, that's not the factor. So there, poles are placed relatively similar cadence, right? But there's so many other variables that go into the cost to underground that it is not something that we can say, oh, well, if you're 100 feet wide, then, the fee is going to be X to underground because of boxes and guidelines and poles, and does it also have phone in addition to electric? We actually tried a couple years ago to come up with a way to propose a fee in lieu of undergrounding if it was exceeding some sort of ratio of cost to frontage. And there are so many, you have to do an impact fee study that says, here's the reasonable fee. There are so many variables that go into the cost of undergrounding. We could not come up with, at the time, a sort of reasonable nexus of what a fee in lieu would be based on frontage length. We might try that exercise again if we move forward with sort of researching this. But our challenge has been that it literally is just that one sentence in the code. So if we want to create some relief in certain areas, we could do that. If your goal is aesthetics, we can sort of help that inform a decision. We have seen projects walk away because they cannot afford, after going sort of through the design process, they cannot afford to do the utility undergrounding. And that may be fine if we say, sorry, it's really important to us that we underground this because we want 32nd, 38th, 44th to look good. We also have a tool that you should know about, 1% fund. So I'm not going to remember exactly where that money comes from, but we essentially, I think it's 1% of all, I'm not even going to pretend to make it up.
It's 1% of Excel's franchise. Yeah, it's part of our franchise, and yeah, they set aside 1% of their profits, I think, net profits in Wheat Ridge, and then we can use that. We never get the money; it's in Excel's bank, and we can use that for undergrounding. We get about $300,000 to $400,000 a year, and we can borrow ahead 3 years at a time.
Yeah. So we did that on Kipling, near Kipling and 38th. And we
Applewood
sometimes-
Shopping Center.
Yeah,
also.
we do that to sometimes augment a project that is like way cost burdened in terms of undergrounding, but those funds only go so far. So if, to the extent you have any strong feelings about how, where, or whether we underground, we will attempt to make the code more clear in that direction. If there's sort of a mixed bag and we're not sure, we can certainly do more research just in general and bring that back too.
I think my issue is going to be definitely more life safety of, when we get these bad winter storms, and then unfortunately, I don't know that the city has a policy on proximity of placing trees to overhead power lines. At least I'm not aware of it. And then what happens is people have these trees growing through the wires or on top, and then it cuts out the power, and then we have to deal with residents who don't have power. And now they're at home in the wintertime, they don't have heat, and so it's like, well, for me, it's not about aesthetics. It's like if we underground and we prevent that, I think that's a good thing. But on the other hand, I think there could be some unique cases of, say, some smaller infill where maybe somebody, can maybe, I don't know, subdivide it. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a duplex or something, and they, now they need 2 lines instead of having to underground, in between the lots. I'd be okay with that, of not having to underground. But I don't know. I generally feel like if there's an opportunity to probably underground, that it's probably just more of a best practice to avoid these, or we really as a city need to just say, like, you shall not be planting trees, in or around these overhead power lines, because it's a huge problem everywhere I look. It's something I'm very aware of, and we've all seen it when we get these heavy spring snowstorms, and it falls on the power lines, and so I just want it thought through.
Councilor Weaver?
I agree with Mr. Ohm.
Thank you. One thing I'll bring up, and when I developed my office building, or not my office building, the restaurant, we put in a new 3-phase service, but it's coming off of a pole transformer across the alley. So there's big cables coming over to my new service and a service drop. But if we weren't able to do that and needed to go underground and try to set up a transformer pad and a transformer, there's sort of, I would hope that we would be able to have a flexible enough view of the utilities and how they really happen in the real world. Mm-hmm. I agree with Scott, and every chance we have to underground utilities for aesthetics and for the sort of the security and lifetime maintenance of the utility, but just to sort of balance those out. So the question is, does council support staff's review of other cities' requirements to bring back some clarifications and updating on our code? And we do. Thank you. Number 4.
Last topic. So this is regarding public hearing requirements for subdivision plats. I know that's a big topic, saved it for last. We did update our requirement in 2014 regarding subdivision plats going to public hearings. What we have found, even in 2014, we were really out of alignment with other cities, not only in the metro area, but also nationwide. Wheat Ridge is a rarity in that many subdivisions are required to go to public hearings at both Planning Commission and City Council, with few exceptions. And like I said earlier, we've had 125 subdivisions since 2014. 41 of those went to City Council and Planning Commission. 13 went to Planning Commission only, and then 71 were essentially 2-lot subdivisions that were able to be reviewed by staff administratively. Currently, subdivisions containing less than 3 lots are administrative or staff review. 4 to 5 lots require Planning Commission hearing, and then 6 or more lots require both Planning Commission recommendation and City Council approval. We last came to City Council to talk about flag lots in 2018. That was actually a result of a single flag lot that sparked a lot of controversy, and that conversation ultimately did not result in any change in the code. And at this point, we're seeking to revisit discussion on the review process to better manage public expectations. A lot has changed since 2014 and even 2018. We've gotten a lot more sophisticated in how we engage with the community, including the Let's Talk program. And council and staff have increasingly prioritized meaningful public engagement and clear public information, including the expansion of the Wheat Ridge Speaks letter notice. Our current public hearing requirements have a flaw in that we're asking for public engagement and feedback when it can't impact a decision. Subdivisions are created for uses which are already allowed on the property, and so seeking public input on a plat can be really confusing for the public when the proposed use or development is already allowed by the zoning. So lessons learned from some public engagement efforts in our Let's Talk team include a more sophisticated understanding of how to engage with the public and when to engage with the public. So when it comes to subdivision plats, we put decision makers such as Planning Commission and City Council in an uncomfortable position because we mislead the public when we ask for public input and imply that there's discretion about subdivisions. And this conversation is specific to subdivisions. So other things like a rezoning or a special use permit or a waiver, that is something that is up for interpretation, and that's something where there is discretion, whereas a subdivision is something that's meant, it's an allowed use, and it's essentially allowing development to proceed on that property. So all that being said, neighboring communities and peer communities generally have much higher thresholds for when public hearings are required. Lots don't require public hearings at all for subdivisions. Some require them only for a really large scale, and then others require public hearings in limited circumstances. A lot of times public hearings are retained when right-of-way is being vacated because that's a city asset that's then being gotten rid of and given to private ownership. It's pretty appropriate for a public hearing. But routine subdivision applications for both residential and commercial, including townhomes and multi-unit residential, are generally administrative processes, and this is where Wheat Ridge is really out of alignment. Aurora, Boulder, Fort Collins, Thornton, Denver, and Commerce City are exclusively administrative processes. And then a lot of our other neighboring peer communities, Inglewood, Arvada, Lakewood, and Littleton, have significantly reduced public hearing requirements for plats. It's really rare that subdivisions ever go to City Council, with the exception of right-of-way vacations. Wheat Ridge and Golden, I believe, are the only cities, at least on the Front Range, that we could find that go to City Council for routine subdivision applications. So we are out of alignment with best practice in other communities. This has increasingly created some confusion and division in the community. And then from a developer standpoint, hearings also introduce a lot of uncertainty and are inconsistent with other community requirements and add a lot of time to the development review process. We've got required public posting periods. And then from staff's standpoint, it's really a trust issue, and we're expending a lot of resources and introduce liability when we're bringing things to hearing that are otherwise approvable. So we are making recommendations which are pretty substantial, and you guys can think about that, to reduce public hearing requirements for subdivisions to be in line with surrounding communities. We do recommend retaining public hearing requirements for things like right-of-way vacation, and then potentially for things like right-of-way dedication and variances to be consistent with surrounding communities. And along with that recommendation, we're also making the recommendation that if public hearing requirements are reduced or removed, that as a supplement, public information be added to the review process to ensure that residents are still informed. We don't want it to go into a black box and no one knows anything. It could be a formal notice where there's a mailing or a signposting just saying, your neighbor has applied for a subdivision application. If it meets the requirements, it will be approved. Or it could be more informal, potential future public-facing map on our website and website notices. Both are methods that other cities have implemented successfully. And this ensures that the public can still be informed of development, but in a more appropriate way that does not mislead about their roles in the process. We are recommending in this case that this be a separate code amendment to allow some of the other items you want to go ahead and proceed more quickly, and we can come back. So I'll ask the question and then keep going, because there are some minimum recommendations there. But the main question is, does council support looking into removing or reducing public hearings for plats and instead recalibrating ways to inform the public? So if there's not consensus on that topic, we do have a couple of minimum recommendations that we really should still include, and we could probably include in that code cleanup section. And it's really introducing better clarity in the code about how plats are clarified. We just don't have good definitions in our code for how to count the number of lots, if you can believe it. We also don't have the ability to determine the number of lots in consolidation plats. So I think everyone in this room was on council when the Spallone replat went to council. I think it was late 2021. It involved 21 substandard lots of record being consolidated into 3 lots for 3 buildings on the site. The way our code is currently written, that required a city council public hearing, even though it was for only 3 lots. And that's because the code says the amount of lots involved in the replatting instead of the end number of lots. It also was a routine cleanup thing for title, and it still had to go to a public hearing. So we are at a bare minimum saying it's got to be the end number, not the starting number, and clarify which lots are undevelopable, do not count towards that total. And then also, another recommendation we'd like to make at a bare minimum is variances. So Wheat Ridge is the only community that we could find where variances to subdivisions go to council. Those are typically handled by Planning Commission or Board of Adjustment in some cases. We're making the recommendation to Planning Commission to review variances if you're not willing to reduce public hearings across the board. Planning Commission is best equipped to review variances for subdivisions because they already review other discretionary land uses like planned developments. Board of Adjustment is really more for standalone variance requests, but not associated with additional development. So I guess going back to the main question, does council support removing or reducing public hearing requirements for plats?
Mayor Pro Tem Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think Ken, over the years, has kind of said this several times. There's no need to have a public hearing if the public really has no say in what's going to happen, and it can be frustrating for the public. I think back to, was it the Judy Townhomes on 38th, which caused quite a bit of a stir on council, but really the only answer was yes, because everything was met and it was set. The other one was 32nd and Kipling, which was platted, right? And there was a big public outcry, and the other problem is it's quasi-judicial, so we can't talk to the public and really inform them about what's happening because we can't talk to the public about it. So I would definitely support this. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to have public hearings that the public really has no say in what's going to happen. We can vote no, but the end result is going to be, I assume, us getting sued because they met all the requirements. So, and then them building the development with our money. So, I think that we should definitely move forward with this and knock down these public hearings to whatever the bare minimum is. And then I would definitely support, though, because that's one of the only ways the public gets information about this is doing, I think, Scott, you said, formal and informal. I think we should do both and get out the information as much as possible, but we should definitely take it out of our hands because there's no reason for us to be voting on it. Thank you.
Councilor Ohm.
Thank you, Mayor. My short answer, Scott, is yes and yes. I agree with it. Having been on the Planning Commission for 11 years, yeah, it's exactly, you pretty much have to vote, you're compelled to vote yes. And it's frustrating for the citizens to come forward, and it's like, you know what, it really kind of is administrative. So having said that, the one thing that I have had a little issue that I think, I don't know, the occurrence that would happen in Wheat Ridge is the number 3, or 4, you know, where it triggers that. And I've always kind of felt that, I don't know why it's a certain number. I feel like the acreage is just as equally as important, you know, so three very, very small lots versus, you know, a certain size of acreage, you know what I'm saying? You could have 2, you know, I don't know, 2 small or 2 larger acreages, or, you know, the number 3. I feel like there should be another criteria as far as what triggers that public process, so that people don't feel like they're being left out, that it's not just a 3 of any size. But definitely, yes, on both those, I'm very supportive. I think you've gone through this very, very thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Weaver?
Yeah, I really appreciate your presentation. I thought that was a great explanation. I agree with what's been said previously by the 2 counselors. Having also been on Planning Commission before this, it's a lot of time that's spent around something that is basically use by right. And so the public comes in and to have an opinion on this, and they don't really have an opinion because it's a use by right issue of the person being able to subdivide. And while I agree with Mr. Ohm around, yes, there's a magic number, but I think the key is what you spoke about, Mr. Culler, of just the notification process and the education process around where people get educated around what's happening in their neighborhood, and their ability to, before these things, either have voice or learn about what's happening in their neighborhood. And I think that's really key as well. So thank you for presenting that, and I agree with all of the things. Thanks.
Counselor Dozman?
Thank you. Do you have any record of how many subdivisions have failed coming to council?
I don't remember any in my time. There was one that was closed. I think the Judy Townhomes was closed. I think we had 3 no votes on that one. I think Mr. Stites is right, though. The city would be, it would be a liability issue if we did vote no on something that was used by right. So I don't remember any going down. Leah?
And historically, why has city council had the ability to vote on subdivision? Can you give a...
I think we got pushback from previous councils. They thought it was a way to inform the public, but again, I think it's misleading, and I think it's better to change it so that, and educate the public of what these are and what they're not. But yeah, there was just pushback from previous councils. I believe they didn't want to give away that authority.
I think some of it's also tied to just home rule city. So they're going away more and more, but it seemed, especially when looking in Colorado, like this is much more of a local thing where subdivisions go to hearings. This is not even a conversation in a lot of places because they never went to council. I think it was just kind of a historic remnant from when we became a city of lots of things went to hearings, even routine applications.
So even if we had a public input, or not necessarily a public input process, but an information to educate the public as to what's going on, they wouldn't necessarily have any recourse if they disagreed. So like with the Judy Townhomes, you know, we did a blanket rezoning of 38th Avenue to MUN, and many people disagreed with those efforts, and the Judy Townhomes specifically was in regards to like an old, you know, deed, right, or agreement between
Deed restriction.
yes, and so that kind of came into question, and that history. So what would the public's recourse be beyond just being educated to the point of like this is going to happen? And
There's very minimal recourse with the subdivision. So one of the other big differences is that a zone change is approved by ordinance, and so you have the opportunity for referendum. When you approve a subdivision plat, it's approved by resolution. There is no sort of appeal or petition or referendum that can happen. So the time to have a hearing and to have the public sort of have a say is when we're talking about what use is permitted. But once we get to subdivision plat, whether it's a new zoning or a long time existing zone designation, there is not a recourse, nor is there intended to be sort of at that stage in the process, because it's really about how is the land going to develop under the permitted use.
Yeah, I would say like for the Hilltop Estates, 32nd and Kipling, that was zoned R1 since before Wheat Ridge was even a city. And so it's always been zoned for low-density, single-unit homes. And that was still a very controversial, despite it being used by right. So I don't know, I guess there was never opportunity for the public to engage in that one because it was always zoned R1.
But there was a rezone
That's what I was gonna say.
attempt.
There was a rezone attempt,
Failed.
yeah, and it
And
failed.
it failed. So that's when the public spoke up and council voted no on the rezone. So it stayed single family instead of allowing for townhomes.
I will say that it's like since being on council, there have been a couple different procedures that we've taken that are confusing as to not only subdivisions, but also, first reading where you have the ability to vote yes or no, but the expectation is for everybody to vote yes. As well as anything that's not expressly allowed in our code is prohibited, which, that's kind of backwards for me with the way government should work. But I appreciate the explanation, and I do think that our city just being, with its history and wanting to control a lot of development, that's where this was derived from. And I will say that it would help with the community's understanding and future council members if this power or this option was taken away, but I don't necessarily think that is what our citizens would want. I think that we've seen a lot of citizens come to speak out against various subdivisions, like the 2018 flag lot, the Judy Townhomes, 38th and Upham, anything that they, believe would be increasing the use when it wasn't intended to be that, even if you're consolidating lots. And so that's kind of where I might draw the line with the threshold. If we're consolidating lots and then subdividing, I want that to be able to come before council, even if it's a use by right.
Doesn't change the use, though, if I heard you say, a subdivision won't change any uses on the property?
Correct. I'm
Yeah,
saying
okay.
so for example, the 38th and Upham project,
Yeah.
where we had 3 R1s or R3s, right? And so if we consolidated those 3 lots, then it would allow for a higher density project as opposed to 3 lots with a single family home.
Yeah, I think that's been our biggest challenge for all people, public, council, planning commission, is educating the difference between zoning and subdivision, right? And we need to always sort of beat that anthem of like, what is zoning, and here's why it's so important and why it's really important that you come to the hearings and why it should be a discretionary hearing, because zoning lasts for a really long time and it does inform the potential. You've heard us say when we bring mixed use, like, yes, the applicant wants to do townhomes, but you need to know it could be any of these potential uses, right? And I think the challenge that we've seen as we've tried to, a couple of things. In 2014 and earlier, I don't think we had the tools nor frankly the interest in leaning into informing and educating beyond a public hearing. So that was sort of our one tool in the toolbox. So we used it for everything. And I think my viewpoint is that we've done a better job of sort of educating people on how government works and building trust, and that we start to erode that when somebody walks in here thinking that they're going to have an impact and then they can't or they don't. And, that may be their only time in City Hall. And, you see the faces on folks when you've got a whole crowd and you're trying to give comments before the motion or the vote to say, like, we really appreciate you coming, because you know they're going to be really upset and feel like they just spent their whole evening here. So my biggest challenge personally is that I just feel like we're misleading people. We can do better in educating folks the difference between zoning and subdivisions and what this change is going to be. And we have been talking about revising our letters so they're not like a government-y public notice letter, and that it's really like an informational flyer. We think you're going to care, and here's what you need to know about the situation. So, what you were talking about in terms of change of use, like that could happen under just any development without a subdivision. So that would be a threshold that I would say is, you know, we were talking earlier about commercial uses, like if it's changing from a dentist to a restaurant, like where do we draw the line and whether we need to inform people on the change of use? Our goal is no surprises at the end of the day, right? For the developer, for you, for the community. And so if that is our goal, then I do feel like we can calibrate how we communicate no surprises.
So, but just in the event of the example, like on Upham, where they're all zoned the same, so they have the same use, but if they're being consolidated and then subdivided, would that come before council still, or no, would that be administrative subdivision?
No, so our primary recommendation is to say that plats should not be reviewed by council because the zoning is the permitted use. Your proposition is a good one because you're saying if the lot size becomes bigger and then it's eligible for a different type of development, you know, should that be something we consider? The other side of that coin is just that the zoning already sort of allows that to be the case, so.
But only if it's consolidated.
Sure. Which, and this is gonna get super into the minutia, where we're not taking out the provision that says you cannot consolidate multiple substandard lots for multifamily development unless the predominant surrounding land use is multifamily development. That has been in here forever. That is why East Wheat Ridge has not converted to multifamily development despite being significantly zoned R3. So there are a small handful of properties that would be allowed to consolidate for the purpose of multifamily because of the predominant adjacent land use. So
Which Upham would have fallen under that.
they did, and that's
Yeah.
why they were allowed to proceed with the rezoning. Well, try the rezone and try to consolidate, yeah.
Okay,
So it's a small category, you're right.
thank you.
Counselor Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. So when you're talking about notification, are you talking the 600 feet?
We haven't gotten into the weeds, but we'd be open to your
Oh, let's do
recommendations.
the weeds.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just
We haven't made
wondering
it, we have
because
not
that's what-
specified what
it's
public
out there.
notice would be, yeah.
Right? Okay. And I know that when some things have gotten voted down, so like development on 38th or, you know, Eaton Place. Okay, I asked the developer, are all of these townhomes going to be market rate or any, you know, less than market rate? Oh, no, they're all market rate. And that's what I see is going on with the developers and things. Are we going to ask for developers to do a certain percentage of building that would be more affordable than market rate?
Well, that's what the affordable housing strategy was and does recommend. And part of what we're suggesting this evening will go to some of the recommendations in the affordable housing study, but I think Scott in his memo talks about some next steps, which we're not talking about tonight, but inclusionary zoning, creating a new zone district for R4. That would help with those. But yeah, we'd never had policy around that before, Judy, until we did the affordable housing study.
Well, I just heard on the news tonight, City of Denver, the applications for building have gone down because of, you know, asking for, you know, more affordable housing. It's gone down a lot since the last year or so, or whatever. So, anyway.
Thank you. Counselor Nosserback?
I just am thinking about the public and how they've become very used to using this process as a way to communicate, especially with counselors or people who are potentially running for office, and I think that if this gets brought back to us, I think we really need to think about how this is communicated, that we're not taking it, even though we have all these other forms of communicating now, and this is administrative and all of those things make perfect sense. I'm just thinking back to when I was running for the office I'm in right now and knocking doors on Everett Drive, and there were conversations about flag lots and subdividing of not larger projects like this, and just people using this opportunity for public hearings and notifications on these administrative pieces that's how our community is used to communicating with us. And so I'm just saying, if we're going to be making this change, I think we really need to be intentional on how we're communicating out or phasing in this new process. Because some people are not using Let's Talk, for example. They are still going to plan to do this the same way that they have, and they'll feel like their voice isn't part of this anymore. That's just my 2 cents on this. Thank you.
You know, when I think about communicating this, to me, I think it's more of sort of redrawing the legal descriptions of property. It's really a surveying technique on the way we draw legal descriptions and survey lines around a piece of property so it's really more of a technical exercise than it is it's not a policy question. It's really, you know, does a surveyor have the lines right in this, and do they comply? Sorry, Councilor Weaver.
I agree with you. I think it also falls on us as counselors to communicate that when the policy piece is, and the policy piece is in the zoning. And if and so really empowering people to get their opinion out there in that process so that they're not disappointed in this process.
And really,
and explaining exactly what you just said.
Yeah, and make them aware that it's really a process by right, you know, that it's a technical requirement in order to bring the property into conformance with whatever the use is. And then it's really confusing where you have the zoning, which gives you this sort of a use, and then you talk about different uses. So there's a restaurant use, or a parking lot use, or other uses, and I think that's sort of a confusing concept. Not that most of it isn't confusing.
Try to simplify it.
Any additional? So the question we have on page 11 was, should staff bring back an ordinance removing or reducing public hearings for plats, and either instead or additionally recalibrating ways to inform the public? Do we have agreement on that, or consensus on that? And then additionally, support minimum recommendations to clarify how plats are classified and how variance subdivisions are reviewed. That's sort of the other half of that, so we have consensus on that to move forward, so that's okay. Okay?
Well, for that one, just to follow up, because these are thoughtful comments, we won't advance that to an ordinance until we come back to you to explain how we would inform the public in lieu of hearings, because it feels like that is the linchpin and what will make this succeed or fail for all of us.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And let's go ahead and have a round of discussion before it gets on the dais.
Yep.
Okay, Mr. Cutler, you've got recommendations coming.
That's it. Well, we got a lot of feedback from council already. I did want to note the future topics. So a lot of the questions tonight, this was really designed, and we're coming back to a study session on some of these topics, which appreciate that. This was really meant to be like a quick code cleanup in a lot of ways. And so there are a few items that we'll go ahead and move forward to ordinance, but it sounds like about maybe 5 of these will need to come back for study session. These future topics were really not related to these quicker code amendments, specifically because they are going to require a lot more research and staff collaboration. So defining how mixed-use projects are defined, what height bonuses look like, inclusionary zoning requirements for affordable housing, which could potentially include a requirement to include a percentage of affordable housing or fees in lieu. There was talk about an R4 zone district, so all of those topics are going to come back at a separate study session, is my understanding. So not part of the recommendations tonight, but just making you aware.
Okay.
That's
Well,
all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cutler. A lot of work going into that memo. Great job.
Thank you.
You bet. Good job, Scott. Okay, good. We are going to take about a 9-minute break, and we'll be back here at 11.
The 11?
Until, yeah. At 11 on my clock, you know. 9.
We have 2 more things, but they will be very short,
Yeah.
unless you have tons of questions, but we think they should be short.
Okay.
5 minutes for alleys and 5 minutes for council rules, I think. So,
All right, well,
Oh,
what's
you just
the,
want to do it? Or do you think you're going to have a lot of discussion about either one of the next two items?
all right, look.
That's what we're worried about. If it's going to be 2 hours of questions, you probably need a break.
Okay, thanks. Okay, you want to keep going? Okay. Our next item is the Clean Fleet Retail Delivery Fee Exemption from Sales Tax. Mr. Goff?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ally is pulling up the presentation here. We were going to bring this forward with the bag fee discussion that we had, if you remember, and I just paid bag fees today. I just totally forgot about that. At Safeway, I know. She said, "Do you want a plastic bag?" I said, "Why are you asking?" It's like, "Oh, because I have to pay for it." But there was a discussion by the former Mayor Pro Tem, not to put it on her while she's not here, but she wanted to have a bigger discussion about this. This has to do with taxing the retail delivery fee that the state has implemented recently. So, Ally, you want to?
Yeah.
You ready?
Sure am. This will be really fast, although I'm here to answer your questions. Okay, you're going to time me? Great. So yeah, the Clean Fleet Retail Delivery Fee. I put a presentation together just because it keeps me on track. So any customer, effective July 1 of 2022, any customer ordering items that are subject to sales tax, like restaurant deliveries or online shopping, applicable groceries, etc., and are delivered by motor vehicle are now charged a 27-cent retail delivery fee. Again, this went into effect last July. It applies to the entire order. It's not on each item. So if some things aren't eligible for sales tax, but one item is, then the 27-cent fee is charged. It's designed to offset infrastructure repair costs from increased delivery vehicles. And in Wheat Ridge, per our current code, the fee itself is subject to sales tax of 3.5%. And so for a number of reasons, staff recommend to council that we actually exempt the delivery fee from taxation. Done? No more slides. Okay. We will get revenue regardless from this because about 6 cents of each delivery fee will go to the Highway Users Tax Fund, the HUTF, and we get about $1 million of that each year. And just from some initial estimates, sort of following the same formula, the city will receive an additional approximately $15,000 from HUTF because of the retail delivery fee. So we will be receiving revenue. Again, the staff recommend that you all amend the current tax code to just exempt the fee from taxation. Number one, we're receiving money already through the HUTF. Number two, it'll be quite a burden on staff to actually implement this. So we estimate that'll cost about $3,500, and it's hard to predict the revenue that it would generate, but we think it'll be between $500 and $3,500 a year. We think it's an additional burden on Wheat Ridge residents and customers. And also, the staff are heavily involved in CML's tax committee that work on sort of tax simplification. And the majority of home rule cities in Colorado are working on exempting this fee from taxation, and our neighbors already have. So there's just a little chart up on the screen that shows those municipalities that we know either have or exempted the fee or are about to in the next couple of weeks. And you'll notice that Arvada, Denver, Lakewood are all on that list. So this is a simple code amendment. We would bring it back in first reading. It wouldn't require a study session. It's very similar to the retail delivery, the bag fee. So with that, I'll answer any questions. How did I do, Councilor Hutchinson?
Okay.
If I could can I add real quick?
You may.
Just real quick, in fairness to Ms. Holteen, our former Mayor Pro Tem, she asked to have this on the agenda. I think her concern was that there's a lot of retail deliveries these days, and somebody needs to pay for the infrastructure. But I don't think she knew at the time that we are getting, there is a 27 cents fee and part of it's going to HUTF.
I don't think we knew that either
So
at the time.
we didn't know that until very recently.
Yeah.
So there is money. The
Yep.
fee portion is going to infrastructure repairs. We're just recommending not to tax it.
exactly, yeah.
Mr. Ohm?
I have one short comment. Yeah, the $534 for the year, I don't need to do the math, but I would imagine at some point, the city must have a kind of a bottom fee of like, it takes so much staff time to do all this, and does this make sense? And my gut feeling is probably not. So let me know when I can raise my hand for support.
Any other questions? Would we like to direct staff to bring a whatever kind of,
It'd be a first reading ordinance on first
an
reading,
ordinance to exempt this from tax? We do. Thank you very much for that presentation.
yeah. Thank you.
Good to keep your slides short. Let's see. Because we're going to spend the time on the council rules. This is item number 3. This is review of council rules and order of procedure. One of my favorites, Mr. Goff.
Thank you. Oh, it is. Keep your questions short, please, Mr. Mayor. As you remember, this came up at the council retreat a few weeks ago. Primarily, the first question was, should we look at changing the start time of our regular meetings from 7 to 6:30, as we do with our study sessions? The Planning Commission has recently made that change. There were 2 other small requests, I believe, to include language in the rules that the expectation is that city council members are reading the online comments that are submitted through Wheat Ridge Speaks prior to the respective meeting, and also add language to the rules that council members are expected to attend meetings in person and should attend virtually only as a last resort. If I caught those right, I think those were the notes both Ally and I had. So those were the 3 items that we heard at the retreat. Council rules requires us to, or I think actually code or rules, I think our code requires that these be brought forward first to a study session, and then they come back as a motion for approval if you'd like to make those changes.
Questions or comments on agenda item number 3? Mr. Ohm?
I think it's a great idea to have it all uniform, so all our citizens know 6:30 is the new 7. It's a great idea.
Okay, further discussion? Okay, so do we have consensus to make the 3 changes, or have those brought back to us, items 1, 2, and 3? We do, okay. Good, that concludes our business meeting items. Let's go to the agenda. Staff reports, Mr. Goff.
Just real quickly, speaking of our retreat, there was direction to move forward with investigating a potential ballot question. We're working on that now. I just wanted to update you that we did select a polling firm, Magellan Strategies. We have a meeting with them this Friday, to start talking about some polling questions. We'll bring that back to City Council soon, before those go out, of course. But so that's moving forward. Just want to give you a heads up on that.
Thank you. Elected officials reports. Oh, staff? Ms. Scheck.
That's okay. If I could, thank you very much, Mayor. Just a quick heads up for you all that I believe you know that we're working on refreshing the website. This new site will have updated navigation with ADA accessibility in mind. It's in its final stages, and it'll go live on February 21st. So next Monday or Tuesday, you will all receive an email from Communications Manager Amanda Harrison. She's looking for help in testing the different features and navigation on the site. So she'll send out a form to you all and a number of residents and business owners and folks out in the community. We've put together a list. She'll be sending out a form with a series of questions asking you to complete tasks on the website and rank the ease for which you're able to complete them. This will help us identify challenges before the website launches. And so anything critical we'll fix before the site launches on the 21st. And then everything else will be used to sort of fine-tune the navigation throughout the rest of the year. So just a heads up, look for that starting next Monday. Thank you very much, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Any elected officials reports? Okay, we're going to go around the room. Ms. Dozeman.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I saw former Chief of Police Dan Brennan this weekend at a wrestling tournament, and he wanted to extend my hellos to everyone and say that he misses us, but I think he's really enjoying retirement. I got to see some of his family, so just wanted to pass on his good greetings. And then I also wanted to let the public know about a fun event this weekend called Galentine's Wine, Women, and Wellness. It's this Saturday at Vantage Salon from 2 to 3:30. At which the address is 6390 West 44th Avenue. You can sign up via Facebook, and then you can also find it on the Local Works website. So it has several community partners, including Vantage Salon, Chibo Meals, Sweet Ridge Studios, Local Works, and Wild and Precious Optimal Living, which is actually a chiropractor here in Wheat Ridge that my children have gone to, and they offer wonderful care. So if you want to support businesses and meet women prior to Valentine's, I highly suggest that event.
Thank you. Councilor Hutchinson.
I also saw today Sandalwood Rehab was on TV. They had a little session on there interviewing a 90-year-old man who is a baker, and he makes banana bread there. And he's worked there for several years, and when we did have a snowstorm, he needed to get there. And so the way that he got there, he was the only baker who showed up. He called the police, and he got a ride. So,
All right.
90 years old, he's still working, and apparently makes good banana bread.
Good.
And one other thing, something to look forward to, 42 days until spring.
Okay. Thank you. Councilor Noslerback.
Just a shout out to our awesome community in Wheat Ridge. At Wilmore Davis, just in an effort to start to make the transitions a little bit easier and start building some communities with the new schools that students will be transitioning to. Stevens Elementary hosted Wilmore Davis for a talent show last week, and it was so fun. And so many of the kids that were just upset that they were having to leave their school were at the new school, and they were like, this stage is so awesome, and they were thinking that the facility was really cool. So, our community is awesome and really figures out a way to heal quickly. So I'm proud of everybody. And then one other thing that's awesome about Wheat Ridge is my daughter and I were at Out of Step Clay, because we're both taking pottery there now. And my daughter dropped her cell phone, that I can't believe she has one, in the parking lot, but we didn't know where she dropped it. We had just lost it. And I got a random email from Paige at Local Works who said the owner of Wheat Ridge Cyclery had reached out and saw that it had my daughter's last name on it and reached out to me. And I just think it's amazing that we're talking about all the business and how busy the city is, but we're just still such a small town. And my kid got her phone back, and she got her privileges back yesterday after a couple of weeks. But anyway, thanks. I love you, Wheat Ridge, so much.
Resilient and friendly. Terrific. Mr. Stites?
Just a shout out to Mestizo Brewing Company. We had our business district meeting there the other day, and they were wonderful hosts. They're a fantastic Wheat Ridge family and Color Strand family. So looking forward to their ribbon cutting in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Terrific. Councilor Ohm?
Thank you. Yeah, let me know when that's going to come about, because I had a good chat with Ryan, the owner. I have a question for Ellie. Is it possible that we could get some type of, I don't know if it's going to be a meme or something, just about how some of that criteria for the web, just to be informed.
The ADA?
Yeah, just to
Absolutely,
kind of be
yes.
informed.
Yes.
Like,
if I
does it apply to like governments? Does it apply to all businesses? Does it apply to people that are politicking? I don't know.
Certainly, Mayor, I won't take time tonight, but I think this would be a really good
Okay.
update. Amanda's providing one to our executive management team next week,
Okay.
and then we can transition into a broader update.
I think it's a great topic for general knowledge. I've been approached about my website at the business, and is it ADA compliant? And I said, well, I know about, slopes. Wheelchair slopes, but not websites. So yes, if there's a presentation there, I think that'd be great.
Thank you. And then do we know, I saw the thing on Jeffco's website about the property disposition. Is the public, it's public knowledge, but does the public know? Like, because that's a big thing.
Nobody knows nothing.
Okay.
everybody's confused, and they said that there was a process starting like in January.
Right.
It doesn't sound like it's starting until like,
Because I've seen it, it's on their website. If you go to the Jeffco website, all the information's there, but it's hard to find.
yeah, they don't know. Nobody
Okay.
knows.
I think I saw something either in the transcript or the Gazette about Jeffco.
I sent you an old email too, I think
Yeah,
last
I
week,
saw that
that the
too.
school district sent out.
I was not aware of it. I knew.
That's the first we
something's-
heard too, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're setting the process up. Yeah, it's
Okay.
later than they expected.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's see, I got a terrific newsletter from the Wheat Ridge Historical Society this week. I hope you all saw it. They're a great organization. I think they've done a great, really a lot of improvements out at the properties that they help maintain. And I know that they do a second Saturday event, and this coming Saturday, which is, I think, the 11th day of February, they'll have something going on at about 10 o'clock. And remind everyone that I have coffee with the mayor this Saturday also, second Saturday at Vanola's on 38th Avenue at 9 o'clock. And hope to see everyone there. Is there anything else to come before us tonight? We will stand adjourned. Drive safely.